going through pension records, I found 31 participants who were under 18. And you got the 13-year-old, 3 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 19 16-year-olds. One of my favorites, he concludes his pension application by saying that my country had my services and the Tories were my schoolhouse when I should have been at school.
You are listening to Historyman, the platform for historians, curators, and authors to tell their stories of the American Revolution, walk in the footsteps of heroes, and proclaim freedom reigns. On today's episode, we are again with William Caldwell, Park Ranger of the Over the Mountain Victory National Historic Trail. Welcome, William.
Thanks, Eric.
William, on some of our last episodes, we had taken a circuitous route, much like the Over the Mountain Men, and we are now down to Cowpens. And we've talked about how Cowpens was located on a fairly well-maintained road and a common road that was almost like a spur between North Carolina and South Carolina, and where the drovers would bring their cattle into the pens there at Cowpens. But when the Over the Mountain Men came to those Cowpens, what did they find?
So that's what's great, because our headquarters are actually located here at Cowpens National Battlefield. So we often get asked, well, what was here at the Battle of Cowpens? And I love to say that there was nothing left by January 1781, thanks to the Over Mountain Men. When these guys arrive, Lyman Draper's big work, Kings Mountain and its Heroes, he talks about what they found, what they ate. He's talking about cattle being slaughtered and cut into steaks, cooked on the coals of the fires being made from some fence rails. So there was at least a small fenced-in area. Usually a cattle pen like this was not entirely fenced. They just used natural features such as creeks, cane breaks, thick woods. But places where there was a corn patch or hogs, those would have had fences. So they're burning the fence rails. They are eating the cattle. Draper refers to a huge patch of corn, dozens and dozens of acres of corn just devoured in minutes. These guys are starving to death as they make their journey down the Over Mountain Victory Trail. I crunched the numbers one time from what they said they were eating and the calories they were expending, and by the time they get to the battle, they're in a deficit of roughly 74,000 calories. So they're finding food here and they're going for it. So it's going to be this pasture. The evening of October 6th, you're looking at these campfires scattered around, this nice glow filling the pasture with the wooded edges. Eventually, roughly 2,000 men and horses just pouring into this area. So you're looking at a scene of both chaos but attempted relaxation. They've been in the saddle 35 miles that day. They are exhausted. It's been a little chilly weather. It's been raining off and on, trying to dry some clothes, check their weapons, and this is their last chance to rest and eat before they are about to get back on the trail.
Who owned the Cowpens at the time?
So we don't know if there was actually a private owner. We know that there was a local man named Hiram Saunders, described as the cattle keeper or the cowpen keeper. I don't believe he actually owned the property. He was more than likely just someone who was kind of charged with keeping an eye on the place, keeping the corn, keeping the hogs, keeping it in a good condition for when drovers did pass through. And then in exchange for that, they would either pay him or pay him in some cattle, pay him in other products, kind of the barter system going on. We don't have private land ownership records until early 1800s.
Oh, that's good to know. Yeah. They broke up into two groups before they pushed on to Kings Mountain. Tell me a little bit about the two groups and how they were made up.
Yeah, so when they're realizing, this plan is actually made the night before at Alexander's Ford, when they're realizing that they may have lost Ferguson's trail, they need to be faster. They're not going to try and have the whole army move together, but they're going to have the horsemen leave first, those who have a good mount. They're going to leave at first light, and then the infantry, those who either didn't have a horse or their horses were injured, they're going to just follow along in a foot column. So that began back on October, the morning of the 6th at Alexander's Ford. And then when they're uniting at the Cowpens, that same decision is going to be made. It's while they're camped there trying to get their rest that some of their spies and scouts start to come in. Joseph Kerr, Enoch Gilmer, and they say, we have found Ferguson's camp. He is down the road. He's easily within a day's ride, but he's heading towards Charlotte. He's only about a day away from Charlotte in the main British army with Lord Cornwallis. So these guys realize that if Ferguson makes that last push, He's going to be too close to the main British army. He's going to be reinforced. He's going to be too strong. There's no chance of a victory at that point. They have to catch him before he can make it further. So the commanders, they walk throughout the camp. So you see these guys. They are community leaders. They know their men. They're related to some of them. And they know who are the best shots. They knew who has the best horses. And they just walk through and they kind of handpick the 910 best marksmen, the freshest horses. If a guy is chosen and he doesn't have a horse, he is allowed to go and pick any horse that isn't already going. And they form an army of 910 picked guys. They get back on the road about 8:30, 9 o'clock that night, just as a rainstorm begins again. And they're going to go all through the night. And then the infantry are going to wait till the morning and then follow behind.
So they took 900 or so men to Kings Mountain in the flying column. How many did Ferguson have?
Roughly about 1,000, 1,100. It depends if you count there was a foraging party that had been dispatched from his camp that morning, that they're not going to be there for most of the battle. They arrive at just the tail end and then they scatter. But so counting those guys, roughly 1,100.
So is it safe to say that the follow-up column may have made a difference?
Yeah, so I mean, when Ferguson is hearing about their numbers, he knows that he's outnumbered. He knows that he is not going to be able to really take them on one-on-one because of their numbers. He writes to Cornwallis and he talks about that if given the opportunity, he would much rather to attack them than be attacked. That's why he's wanting reinforcements so much, so that he can make some kind of aggressive push, because he knows his loyalist militia will have more of an edge if they are leading the attack, if they're in the charge, rather than being surprised and attacked. And he is very worried about being surprised. That's why you're seeing his marches. He'll have like one day of a good hard push, a dozen or so miles, and then he'll have either a day of rest or he'll have a day of just 1 or 2 miles to keep his guys from being too exhausted, keep them fresh. A few times they're described as laying on their arms that night, so just sleeping in ranks with their accoutrements on, weapon in hand, in case they are surprised. So he knows they're getting close. If those 910 horsemen, they reach Kings Mountain, they attack Ferguson's camp, and they fail, if they break, if they are repulsed, you do have some time before those infantry would arrive. The infantry, by the morning of October 8th, so the day after the battle, they're not even there yet. They're still only about halfway at the Broad River. This is when they reunite with the horsemen who are returning from the battle. So it's more of a question of what would Ferguson have done if he won that first fight. If he's going to stay there, hold his ground, and just try and wait out any potential reinforcements from Charlotte, that would give the infantry that time they need to finally close in and attack again. And I think maybe these guys would have tried for it. But if Ferguson realized, hey, they're too close, I can't wait anymore. If he did decide to fall back to the Catawba River, he would have reached his reinforcements who were waiting for him there, and he would have escaped.
Well, let's talk about the guys in the British Army a little bit up on the top of that knoll of Kings Mountain. There were other people in that encampment other than just men, correct?
Yeah.
So you had camp followers in there, or was it just Ferguson's 2 women?
So you had a few followers. You had a few women who were going to be... It's interesting, there's a few different stories we have. So you have the 2 women who were employed as laundresses by Major Ferguson. It's super common to be employing local women as you're on campaign. Washington did the same thing. You're going to be looking at a few women who are actually described as being prisoners. One in particular had been arrested up in Burke County for somehow harassing the loyalist troops, and they realized, this woman is not going to leave us alone. We have to just take her with us.
Who was that?
Her name is not recorded, but Draper talks about her in Kings Mountain and its Heroes. He says that as soon as she is released, she just starts tearing into the loyalists again, just chewing them out. And he's like, this is probably why she was arrested in the first place. They were concerned about her being a security threat and information risk. So we know that there's local women nearby, at least. We have accounts of local women who had taken supplies to the loyalist camp that morning. The aftermath of the battle, you're going to see the mountains swarmed with the women, children, families of the participants, trying to see if they can give any medical aid. So there are some locals coming and going. And you have a fair amount of prisoners who are not only that woman I mentioned, But you have some prisoners who are with Ferguson being released throughout that day. As the Over Mountain men get closer to Kings Mountain, they find a few of these guys that give them more information. And then there's others who are able to escape during the battle, and they go grab weapons and they take part. A few guys actually talk about they were still prisoners, and they're kind of, the phrasing in their pension record is a little odd, but it sounds like they were locked up, they were prisoners, and they are kept as prisoners until they're on the march away from the battlefield, and they're able to find someone and explain what happened and who they are, and then they're finally released. So there's all different kinds of odd stories. It's not just soldiers up there at the hilltop.
So are there anything unique to some of the broad strokes of history?
Oh, I mean, every time you find a pension application, like on revoirapps.org, there are some amazing small stories that, you know, it doesn't maybe make a big difference to the story, but it does add a little bit of character to it. Like you have a few guys who were loyalists who escaped. There's one story I found where there is this veteran in the 1820s. He's over in Mississippi with his wife. They're having dinner. She's hired a local laborer to come over and have dinner with them. And, oh, I was in the Revolution. Oh, I was too. And they get telling stories. And the guy's like, yeah, I was at Kings Mountain. And I remember there was a Tory who was walking away from me. And I thought, well, I'll show that rascal. He's not running. I'll make him run. And he fires at him. He says he had a handkerchief tied around his head, and he fired, and the handkerchief fell off, and the man just kept walking. He didn't run. And the guy he's having dinner with him, he looks at him. He's like, that was me. He's like, I had vowed that I would not run that day, and your shot cut the knot off of the handkerchief, but I still held true to my vow. And the guy just launches into a tirade that he will not have any D.D. Tory at his dinner table and kicks him out. And his wife is so upset because the job they'd hired him to do hadn't been done yet. She's like, no, we need him to finish the job. Don't get angry yet. Well, there's stories like that. We believed that the wagons, Ferguson had 17 supply wagons formed in a semicircle on the hilltop to help form some defenses. And Draper records that they were pulled over the campfires and burned the next morning when the army leaves. But then there's a pension app from one of Ben Cleveland's guys saying, no, I had one of those wagons. And we were given permission to go ahead and cut out from the army. And he and 6 others took the wagon back up to Wilkes County, North Carolina. Which is, there's this, you know, I love conspiracy theories and what ifs. It's like, okay, there's all this plundering happened. There's Ferguson's china being taken, his tea towel, his silver whistles, his commission, all this stuff. Ben Cleveland was taking Ferguson's horse in a drum that he captured. And here's some of Ben Cleveland's guys with this mystery wagon cut out from the army. It's like, well, what else did they have in that wagon? Well, what did they possibly pick up from the hilltop? There's all kinds of great stories like that.
Do we have any records concerning Native American involvement?
So we don't, surprisingly. And this is something that can definitely use some more research about the Native American participants. We know that the guys, the Patriot Army at least, they have a lot of experience fighting against Native American nations, the Shawnee, the Cherokee, and this is going to really shape their leadership styles, their fighting styles. We have references to the commanders telling them, give them Indian play, you know, go tree to tree, don't try to stand your ground, but kind of ebb and flow with the battle. Them using a frontier war whoop, as one account calls it, as a signal for when you're in place and when you want to begin the attack. So we have these kind of elements of American Indian combat being seen, but we don't have any references to American Indian participants. In another episode, I believe we talked about the British policy towards the use of American Indian allies, and how Cornwallis had kind of been opposed to the idea. Ferguson mentions it in his proclamations. He makes this big deal about saying, oh, the Patriots are angry because of the Indian allies. And he's like, at this time, the only American Indians in combat are the Catawba on your side. So what are you doing throwing shade on us for using American Indians when you're doing the same thing? But then afterwards, you kind of have that shift, and Thomas Brown, superintendent of Southern Indian Affairs, is kind of directed to encourage native attacks against the frontier more, to just keep these over mountain guys occupied from keeping back later. So a few on like big picture involvements, but no records that I've seen so far.
Well, tell me about some of the African Americans on either side that were involved here.
Yeah, so you've got some really big names. It's a big part of the story. John Brodie is going to be one of those big names. He was an enslaved man held in slavery by William Campbell. And this is going to come around later on in the 1820s. You have this controversy, people saying that William Campbell was not involved in the fighting, when you have all of his guys and men who he was with saying, no, he was right there in the thick of it. He is, especially at the end of the battle, when you have the loyalists trying to surrender, Campbell's going around and knocking rifle barrels down, telling guys to, don't shoot, cease firing, they've surrendered. But this controversy comes, and one of the sources for that controversy is where William Campbell had a horse who was like his favorite horse, but it was known to be a bit gun shy. So when he's about to go into battle, he actually gives that to the enslaved man, John Brodie. He's going to take another horse into battle. He is going to take off his coat. He's described as going into battle in his shirt sleeves, William Campbell is. And John Brodie was said to bear a very strong resemblance to William Campbell.
Wow.
So there's a story that he was potentially William Campbell's half-brother. So you end up with a guy who looks a lot like William Campbell, who is riding or holding William Campbell's favorite horse. And Shelby says in the middle of battle, he looks back, and on another hilltop nearby, he sees a guy, looks like William Campbell, got Campbell's horse, and Shelby calls out, like, hey, come on, get in this, let's go. And the guy doesn't make any movements. He doesn't get into the fight. And Shelby believes that to be William Campbell. So this is going to be a source for him saying William Campbell was not involved in the thickest of the fighting and a big part of the fight, when it was actually John Brodie. You have a couple others. There's one man, Esaias Bowman. He's a freeman from Virginia. He is one of the possible marksmen who shot Ferguson. He claims to have shot Ferguson from the horse. And I mean, he is hit 9 times by the time he's taken out of the saddle. So potentially Esaias Bowman. You have a couple other names, Ishmael Titus, Primus. We don't know a lot of stories about these guys just due to the lack of a lot of records about enslaved African American participants. You're looking at the pension records later on were so hard for them to submit and be approved that it is a big lack of information there. But we only have those kind of 3 documented and 2 possible African American patriots.
Any on the British side?
Not documented, no. Okay. Not that I've come across so far. But again, there's tons of room for more research about this.
So tell me about Bloody Bill Cunningham. Was he here?
According to Dr. Bobby Moss's research, I believe yes. You're looking at Ferguson as he's making his push through the backcountry. He is raising, again, thousands of loyalist militia. This is the place to be. This is the army to be with. You are clearing out all the rebel scum from your settlements. This is the force to help. So according to the research done by Dr. Bobby Moss in his book Loyalists at Kings Mountain, you have at least 1 or 2 William Cunninghams, and their service records kind of align with what we know about William Cunningham. And it's interesting because, I mean, he's listed as being a captain in the Fair Forest Regiment, the Loyalist militia by that point. In the aftermath of the battle, you have the executions, the trial at the Biggerstaff plantation on October 14th. And one of the reasons for this is because you have so many prisoners, 713 men taken prisoner there, and they're being escorted by roughly 800 change patriots, and you start to have more and more patriots are deserting, they're going home. It's not a very formal army, and this concern rises up: what would happen if these loyalists escaped and were able to go take vengeance for what has happened at Kings Mountain? And it's interesting because that is a big concern. That's one of the reasons that they decide to go ahead and have a trial and hang some of the biggest offenders in their custody. And possibly this is when William Cunningham is going to escape, is sometime along that march. And I mean, again, like you called him Bloody Bill, you have this clear evidence. Yes, he's going to go back and become a vicious loyalist leader, taking vengeance for all kinds of things. So I think they were very right to be a little nervous and suspicious about what would happen if some of these loyalist militia escaped.
You got the British; they were constantly on the trail, coming off of Musgrove Mill, trying to chase the over the mountain men into the mountains, right? And they run across the McDowells, and they're getting up into the mountains. They send off the proclamations and that sort of thing. Then they hear, oh no, here comes a big army after us, and they turn around and come back down to Kings Mountain. Well, they've been on the trail a long time. My assumption is that they have wagons, and how are they subsisting? That's a lot of supplies for an army.
Yeah,
to be on the trail that long.
they're covering a lot of ground. I mean, we have some great diaries of Loyalist officers: Anthony Allaire, Uzzel Johnson, Alexander Chesney's recollections from September 1st, when they kind of really, I kind of point to that moment as when they really begin their push towards North Carolina to get on this campaign. From September 1st to October 7th, in their whole roundabout circuit, they cover 266 miles. And we know they've got a baggage train, those 17 supply wagons that are at Kings Mountain. Mostly they're going to be camping at Patriot plantations. They're going to find, again, they got an army of locals. They know where these guys live. So they're going to go to their plantations, and they're going to take the property, take the food, take the produce, the livestock. And that's one of Ferguson's big things. He's like, we are not looting, we're not plundering, we're paying. So as they're going, he says you can take these certificates to any British headquarters outpost and receive payment for that. And they are just kind of gathering food as they go. But they're not staying in one piece. That's one big key feature here is, any large number of men and horses is hard to provide for. So they are going to be breaking up into different little smaller groups. Usually you'll have the baggage column with prisoners, and any sick or wounded are going to be separate. You have kind of the main body, and then you have Ferguson with like an advance force further up a trail or a different trail. And they're going to, especially as they're falling back, they're going to detach one of these groups to go over to so-and-so's plantation for a day or two to lay in a bunch of provision, prepare a bunch of food, bring it back with them. And so they're surviving and sustaining pretty well. None of their records talk about starvation level diets like the Patriots did at that same time.
That's interesting. I know we talked about the African Americans. We talked about some of the women. We talked about at least the Native American influence, if nothing more than that. But we've got teenagers involved in this battle. Tell me a little bit about some of these teenagers.
Yes, that's one big thing to think about is our perception of who is a soldier. We usually say, 18, 17, 18. When you're looking at militia law, both pre-revolution and during the war, 16 is the age of service. That's when you are part of the militia. You are required to serve in your militia is 16 years old. But then you have guys who are younger than that who can prove their service. They're strong enough, they're tall enough, they can bear arms, they're allowed to go as well. And then sometimes you have children of officers. One guy, actually, I was reading his pension application, he says that he's very young. I want to say he was actually 13 or 14 years old, and he was taken with his father, who was a captain. His older brothers were in the company, and he says he was not left at home because it was safer for him to be on campaign with his family than left home by himself, where he would be viewed as a potential soldier or at least a spy. You see accounts of some of these guys, they're in arms, 15, 16 years old at Kings Mountain. They'd been serving the cause for years already and being scouts, spies, messengers for their brothers, their fathers, militia regiments. So far, going through pension records, I found 31 participants who were under 18. You got the 13-year-old, 3 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, 19 16-year-olds. One of my favorites, he concludes his pension application by saying that my country had my services and the Tories were my schoolhouse when I should have been at school. And then Thomas Young, when he is giving his story of the battle, he's 16 at the battle. James Williams is shot, and he goes over to him. He says that James Williams had ever been so kind to me, almost always carrying a cake in his pocket for me and his little son Joseph. So here you have this great, not only are these, they're soldiers, they're bearing arms, he is in battle, but he's still young enough that one of the officers views him as a kid and has a little cookie, a cake in his pocket, and he gives it to him when he sees him. That really kind of highlighted for me the youth and the innocence of some of these guys.